Hey, and welcome to this video. We're going to cover off how to create this exciting weather app using the Flask, micro framework, and Python. By the end, you'll have created this entire website here, which lets you input a city name, such as Toronto, a state, as well, in this case, a province, and a country. And then we can query that location and return the current weather conditions. So for example, if we wanted to search for Miami, then we could type in Florida and the US, and we can get the current weather conditions in Miami. All right, let's get started and dive in how to do this. All right, let's head over to Visual Studio Code. So we're gonna create a new folder here, and within this folder, we'll activate a virtual environment. So in order to do that, we'll open up our terminal, and we'll type in Python 3 m VNV, and then we'll name our virtual environment also VNV. Now to activate this environment, what we're gonna have to do is type in source VNV bin activate. We can see that our virtual environment has been activated because we now see it listed here. So we'll need to install a couple of dependencies, and in order to make this process simpler, let's create a requirements.txt file. So we'll create a new file here, and I'll zoom in a little bit so that we can follow along better. So the different libraries that we'll need for this tutorial are Flask, we'll need requests, and we'll also make use of the python.env library. So we'll save this, and now we can install all of these directly using the pip install our requirements.txt. So what this will actually do is it will read the requirements.txt file, the one that we've just created, and install all of the libraries that are listed there. So let's go ahead and run this command, and this will loop through the entire installation for us. So we can see that all of our applications have now been installed. So in order to actually get this weather data, we're going to need to access the OpenWeather API. So feel free to skip this step if you already have an account and already have a working API key. So when you hop over to the OpenWeatherMap.org website, you can hit the sign in key here and actually access the different portals. You might still need to create an account. Now go ahead, create the account, and then we'll log into the site. Now from here, what we're going to do is access our account. So we're going to go to the My API Keys section. So from here, we can see all of the different API keys that we have. If you don't have one, you'll want to create one here and give it a meaningful name. Then go ahead and copy that API key, and we'll paste it into a .env file in our project. So back in Visual Studio Code, what we're going to do is create a .env file. And all we're going to do with this file is create a single environment variable. So we'll call this API key, and we'll paste in our API key. So from now on, we can actually reference this API key and actually upload this to GitHub and add this file to gitignore so that we don't accidentally share our API key with the rest of the world. So now that we have these two requirements, let's switch back over to the OpenWeatherMap and see what we need in order to be able to access weather information. So let's go ahead and click on the API section. So what we can actually do is get the current weather data. So let's explore this documentation a little bit. And so in order to be able to access weather information, we need three different pieces of information. We need the latitude, the longitude, and our API key. Right now, we probably only know our API key. I definitely don't know the latitude and longitude for my own home address. So we're going to need to find a way to actually get this lat and long information. So by exploring this API documentation a little bit more, we can actually see that OpenWeatherMap provides a geocoding API. So what we can do here is actually get some of our latitude and longitude information. So we can make use of this endpoint here by actually just passing in a city name a state code, and a country code, as well as our API key. So let's go ahead and copy this. And we'll first focus on actually gathering our latitude and longitude. So what we're going to do is switch back over to Visual Studio Code. We'll create a new file here, and we'll keep all of our actual processing functions and all of that in a separate file called weather.py. So what we're going to do in here is create a function called getLatLong. And so in order to be able to query the internet, we of course need to use the requests library. So what we're going to do now is create a function called getLatLong. So what we want to do is define a function, we'll call it getLatLong. And so what this will actually do is it will query that specific endpoint. So in this case, we can say that our response, or we'll just call it resp, is equal to requests.get, and we'll pass in this string here. Now, what we're going to want to do as well is actually turn this into an F string so that we can access the city name, the state code, the country code, a possible limit, as well as the API key. So in order to be able to run this as a function, what we need to do is pass in our city name, the state code, the country code, and the API key as parameters. So in order to do this, let's first turn these into actual valid code here. So we'll just remove all of the spaces and switch them out with underscores. We're also going to get rid of this limit piece here since we won't actually be using it in our application. And then finally, we'll fix the API key here as well. So what we can do now is pass these in as arguments. So we'll say city name, state code, country code, and API key. So when we run this function, we're going to need to pass in 4 different parameters. So how do we now access, first of all, this API key? So remember that we have our API key stored in this .env file. So what we can actually do is access that using some of the libraries that we installed before. So we'll say from .env import load.env, and we'll also import OS. And so what we can do now is call this load.env function, and that's going to pull the data from this file here. And now what we can do is actually access our API key using the os.getEnv function. So in this case, we'll pass in API key here. And so what this will do is it will actually grab the API key from this file and load it into a variable called API key. So let's go ahead and see if we can actually call this function correctly. So what we're going to do is just print out the content of this response. So what we want to do is call this function and then print it out. So we'll just say print response. So when we call this function, we'll say getLatLong. We'll pass in a city name. So let's say Toronto. State will be Ontario. Country will be Canada. And our API key is going to be this API key. So let's go ahead and run this. And so we can see that we actually get a 200 response back. So that's great. That means that our function was able to correctly authenticate our request and actually return content for it. So what we want to do now is actually get part of what's actually contained in this. And in order to do this, we can call the JSON method. And so this will convert that response object, which we have here, into a valid JSON object if that's possible. So let's go ahead and run this again. And so we can see that we get this list item back. And this list item actually tells us quite a lot about the different attributes related to Toronto, including the latitude and longitude. So what we actually want to do at this point is just return that piece of information. So in order to do that, we'll need to access, since this is a list, the first item in that. So we'll call data is equal to response 0. And so this will now actually return just this dictionary portion here. So in order to access the lat and the long, what we can do is now just grab these different values. So in this case, we want to access lat here. So we'll use the .get method, we'll pass in lat, and for long, we'll do the same and pass in lon here. This should be data. And so what we can do now is just return these two items here. So let's go ahead and make sure that this actually works. We'll print out the result of this function here. And when we run this, we can see that this now returns a tuple containing both the latitude and the longitude. So now let's go ahead and switch back to the API documentation on how to actually query the current weather conditions for a location. So if we hit the back button here, we can see that now we're ready to actually make this API call here because we now have our API key. We have our latitude as well as our longitude. So let's go ahead and copy this URL here. And what we'll do now is we'll create a new function that will get the current weather conditions. So we'll say get current weather. And so in this case, we're going to pass in a latitude, a longitude, and again, an API key. And in this case, our response object, again, we'll use the requests get function, and we'll pass in an f string again. So again, here, what we're going to want to do is simply clean it up so that the space is removed. So this is now a valid f string that accepts these three arguments as their input. So what we can actually do now is we can define a little bit more structure for our project. So let's go ahead and delete this, and we'll just say if name equals main, then we'll say lat lon is going to be equal to get lat long. And again, we'll just, for testing this, pass in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and we'll pass in our API key. So now we have these two values here. So now let's try calling this get current weather function. So we'll say get current weather, and we'll pass in the lat, the long, and again our API key. So right now this won't actually return anything. So let's go ahead and print it out. We'll say print out response, and we're hoping for that 200 response again. So we can see here that we actually do get this valid response. So let's go ahead and convert this to a JSON object again. So when we run this now, we can get all of the contents of that response. So we can see here that this is actually a fairly comprehensive set of information. So in order to be able to parse some of this out, we simply need to read the dictionary. And we don't want to display all of this information. So let's go ahead and create a structure in terms of being able to access this in a clean way. So in order to do that, we're actually going to define a class. So we'll say from data classes, import data class. And so what we're going to do here is actually define a class object that allows us to easily store and retrieve that information. So we'll use the data class decorator, and then we'll say class weather data. And let's think about what we might want to display. We definitely want to display the current conditions. So let's see how we can get that. We have this main key here, which says it's clouds. We may want to also provide this description. Now there's this interesting thing called icon here, and definitely adding that visual component will be great. So let's get icon as well. And then one of the things we'll also want, of course, is the actual temperature. So we can see that we have the temperature here. Now, by default, OpenWeatherMap actually displays the weather in Kelvin. So let's go ahead and change this, just because most people don't know how to read Kelvin. So what we're going to do is just quickly say pass here, so that we don't throw an error. So on this page, we can actually see down here that we can access units of measurement. So let's go ahead and click this. So we can see that a number of different units are actually available to us. So in order to be able to add this in, we can simply add this in as a query string parameter. So let's go ahead and change this in this case to metric. Now you might want to use imperial for your example, and feel free to do that. So in order to do this, what we just need to do is pass in the units with the actual piece that we want to use. So let's go ahead, switch back, and we'll change this URL here, and we'll say ampersand units equals metric. So let's go ahead and run this again and see whether or not that changed. So we can see now that these units are actually now displaying as floating point values in Celsius. So let's go back and define our class now. So we want to be able to access the main weather information. So we'll call this main. We'll give it a data type of string. Then we'll say description. And we'll say string again. We'll say icon is also a string. And then we'll say that we want to use the temperature. And that's going to be a float. So what we can do now is grab all of these values and create this weather data object. So let's go back down here. And we're now going to create a variable called data. We'll pass in weather data. So for main, let's see how we can get at the main value. So we can see that this is a dictionary. And then under weather, we get a list. So what we're going to want to do is access response.get weather. And then we'll want to access the first item of this, which then gives us access to this dictionary here. And then from here, all we want to do is access the main key. So we'll say .get main. Now for the description, we're going to want to do something very similar, but access the description key. So let's make this a little bit easier and just copy this down, and we'll change this to description. So where's this icon? So we can see that the icon is in the exact same place. So let's go ahead and pass in the new argument here for icon. We'll paste this again, and we'll just change this to icon. Now in terms of the actual weather information, this is actually in a different section. So we can see here that we want to access this temperature piece, which is under the main element. So rather than accessing weather, we're going to access main. And in this case, it's a bit different because it doesn't return a list, but simply a dictionary. So in order to access the temperature, we're going to say that we want to access the main, and then we'll just say get temp. So let's go ahead and return this data piece and see whether or not we did this correctly. So we're going to print the result of this. And let's go ahead and run this now. So we can see that this actually did return our weather data object, where we now have access to these different attributes for main, description, icon, and temperature. So now that we've learned how to actually capture all of this information, let's create one more function. And this function is going to serve to actually being able to simply accept a location, a state, and a country, and return the weather information. So we'll call this def, and we'll say main. And what we'll do now is we'll require passing in the city name, the state name, and the country name. And what this will do is it will first get the latitude and longitude, and then it will also get the current weather information. And in this case, we'll say weather data is equal to get current weather. And all this will do is return the weather data. So now that we have this covered off, let's go ahead and actually create our Flask application. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll use the regular conventional call name and call this app.py. So within our app.py, we're going to create our entire Flask application. Now, because this is a single page application, we don't need to define a ton of different structure for this. As you evolve this project, feel free to explore with multiple pages, different layouts, and all of that. So let's go ahead and say from Flask, we're going to import Flask, of course. Then we're going to import render template as well as the request object. Now, from our weather module, what we're going to do is import main. And we'll just say as get weather. And then now we're going to create our Flask application like this. And just a little further down, we're again going to pass in an if name equals main. And in here, we're going to say app.run debug is equal to true. So if you're ever going to plan on deploying this, make sure that you actually change this to a production application. But in order to keep being able to refer back to what our application looks like, we're going to set debug equals to true. Now, because this is a single page application, all of that behavior will actually be rendered by a single route. So let's go ahead and define our first route here. And in this case, our route will simply be the home page. So what we can do is define this now as the index here. And in order to test out whether or not this is working, let's go ahead and say return render template, and we'll say index.html. Now at this point, we don't actually have a template called index.html. So let's go ahead and make that now. So we'll say new file. We'll put this in the templates folder and we'll call this index.html. Now, what should our index.html actually include? Well, we definitely need to include the default HTML structure. So in order to do that, we can simply hit the bang key here and hit enter. Now this will define a lot of that HTML structure. So right off the bat, let's just give our application a name here, or our website. We'll say my weather app. And so what we want to do now is actually just add some body into it. So let's go ahead and add in an H1 here, and we'll call this something like weather app. So now that we have this structure here defined, let's see whether or not our Flask application actually works. We'll go ahead and run this here. We can see that it's been able to actually serve this up on our local host. So go ahead and copy that and paste it into your web browser. So we can actually see that our web page is now rendering correctly. So we can see that both our actual website title as well as the H1 that we created have now been created properly. So let's go ahead and customize this a little bit. And in order to make it a little bit prettier, we'll use Bootstrap just to keep things simple. So go ahead and go to the Get Bootstrap website, scroll down a little bit to the section that says include via CDN. We're going to go ahead and copy this, and this will just give us access to all of the different classes and customizations that Bootstrap gives us. So what we'll do is we'll switch back to our application here. In our index.html, we're going to paste this directly into the head. And so this will actually link to the style sheet. Now, Bootstrap also requires us to being able to bring in some of the JavaScript code. So we're going to paste this at the end of our body. So now that we have both of these in here, let's go ahead and see whether or not our application looks a little bit different. So when we refresh this, we can see that this has already applied some Bootstrap styling to it. So let's go ahead and customize this just a little bit further so that we're not looking at something that looks quite as horrendously ugly as it does now. So switch back to Visual Studio Code. And what we're going to do is actually wrap the entire thing in a div so that we can give it a little bit of styling. So let's go ahead and in our body here, what we're going to do is wrap the entire body in a class. And what we're going to do is type in bg info. So this is going to apply the background color that is called info. And we'll say text is equal to white so that there's a little bit of background. So when we save this, switch back and refresh, we can see that we have this turquoise background with this white lettering now. So what we can do now is actually also give our H1 here a little bit of styling. So right now, everything is kind of pushed up right to the top. So let's give it a little bit of padding. And so in order to do that, what we can do is say the class should be empty, meaning the margin at the top of 5. So when we save this, we can see that it's been pushed down a little bit. Now, you might remember from our weather application that everything was centered. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is wrap everything here in our body in a div. And so we can then apply some of that styling just to that div. So right now, all we want in that div is going to be our h1 here. So our div right now is going to have a class of text center. So when we save this piece, what we get back now is that the text is actually centered, and any subsequent text that we add will also be centered. So now what we need to actually define is the form by which people can enter their city, state, and country. So let's go ahead and do this. So the way in which we can do this is using a form. So when we type in our form attribute, we're going to want to say that the action takes us back to the home page, and the method is going to be post here. So within our form, what we want to do now, and I'm just going to close this so we have a little bit more space, is define those 3 fields. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is actually pass in an input field here, and it will be a text field. What we'll do is give it an ID of city name, and the name will also be city name, and then we'll create another input here, and again it'll be text. Our ID in this case will be state name. Our name will be state name. And what we can also do is pass in a default placeholder here. And so the placeholder, actually no, in this case we're going to have a default value. So what we'll say is it's going to have the value of ON for Ontario. Now in this case, what we're going to want to do is pass in a placeholder value. So we'll just say city. Now for our last input, what we'll do, again, it'll be text. Our ID is going to be country name. Our name is going to be country name. And our value here is going to be Canada. And what this value will allow us to do is not necessarily have to repeat typing in the state and the country each time if we know that we're going to be querying for these places. Now you can set these to whatever location you want as long as it's relevant to you. So in order to being able to submit this form, we're also going to need to include a button. So let's go ahead, we'll add a button here, and what we're going to do is give it the text of find. So let's go ahead, save this, switch back to our browser and refresh. So we can see now that we have this form with 4 different input fields. So we have 3 text fields here where our placeholder text says city just to guide the user, and we have the state, and we have the country, and this button. So what we want to do now is actually see whether or not our application can run this. So let's go ahead, we'll add in Toronto here and hit find. So what we get back now is this method not allowed error. And so when we defined our original function in our app.py file, we didn't pass in what methods this function should accept. And by default, only get methods are allowed. So let's go ahead and change this. So we'll say methods equals get and post. So when we save this now, and we'll reload our web page, let's go ahead and we'll type in Toronto again. We can see that in this case, there wasn't an error, but nothing actually happened. And so the reason that this happens is because the only thing that this function does is render this template. So in order to modify that behavior, what we can do is build in an if statement directly into this function. So we'll say that if request.method is equal to post, do a different action, and then return this template here. So in order just to do a sanity check, let's just say print hi. So when we now switch back and we type in Toronto and we hit find, we can see that this actually picked up that we submitted something using a post request, and so it printed out hi. So what do we want this to do now? Well, we want it to access the information that we pass in our form and actually get the weather information for that. So the way that we can do this now is actually access the form data. So the first piece we'll get is the city. We'll say request.form, and we'll access this by the name. We'll just go ahead and copy this down a bunch of times. And now we'll change this to state name. And we'll do the same here and change this to country name. So what we get back now is actually the city, the state, and the country that the user passes in. So now that we have these, we can actually run our main function here and pass these three values in. Now, the API key will actually get passed in using the environment variable here. So let's go ahead and see whether or not this actually works. So we're going to say get weather. We'll pass in our city, our state, and our country. And again, let's just print this as a quick sanity check. So we'll save this, switch back to our application, reload it, type in Toronto here. And when this is loaded now, we can switch back and see that we actually get this weather object returned. And so now that we have this, we can actually pass this information back to our template and insert it conditionally. So in order to do this, what we can do now is just assign this to another variable. In this case, we'll call it data. Now we need to give this data variable to our actual template to use. And so the way that we can do this is by saying data equals data. Now, we need to be careful here because if the method is actually just a get method, it never actually creates this variable data here. So what we need to do first is we'll just say data is equal to none. This means that we always have a value for data created when we go to the page. So when we save this, what we can actually check now is whether or not our page still loads, and it does. So that's great news. Now, what we want to do is actually display some of this weather information at the bottom of the page. So now that we've passed this in, we can actually grab this data and display it. So let's switch back to our index page here. And what we're going to do is see how we can display this just very naively. So we'll use this Jinja templating here, and we'll just say data. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like when we refresh it. So right now it prints out none. We'll go ahead and type in Toronto. And in this case, it actually returns this entire weather data object. So this is perfect, but we definitely want to hide that none by default. So the way that we can do this is actually by using Jinja templating again. And we'll say if data, and then we'll say and if here. So what this is going to do is check whether or not data exists or is truthy. And if it is, then we return it. Now, because our default value is none, if we use a GET request, this will actually fail. And so it won't actually display the data. So when we refresh this now, we don't see that none value anymore. So let's go ahead and see how we can actually display some of this information. So we can actually access one of these attributes in the data structure by just accessing the attribute directly. So say we wanted to go in and access the description, we could just say data.description. So let's go ahead, save this, refresh over here, and type in Toronto as always. So when we run this, we can see that we actually get this text printed out now. So let's style this a little bit and bring in the rest of the information. So in order to do that, what we're just going to do is we'll access the remaining pieces that we pass in. So let's go ahead and say that we want to bring in data.main, and we'll put this on the same line. And now we want to have a line break, and then we'll bring in data.icon, and then we'll say data.temp. I think I called it temperature, so we'll say data.temperature. Now when we refresh this, pass in Toronto, we can see that we actually get all of that information returned. Now, one of the weird things is that the icon is actually just a text. So what we're going to need to do is actually transform this into an image. And so on the OpenWeatherMap documentation, we can see that we can get an icon just by accessing this URL here. So if we, for example, click on this, we get this icon returned. So what we want to do is replace the string of our icon in here. So let's go ahead and do that now. So rather than just using the icon here, so I'll delete this for the time being, is we'll pass in an image. Our source is going to be that URL, except this piece here is going to be replaced by data.icon. And we'll pass in some alt text and we'll just say icon. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we do this now. So we'll switch back to our weather app. We'll pass in Toronto one more time and we'll hit find. So we can see now that this icon has actually loaded. And so we can take this just a little bit further and actually apply just a little bit more styling to this. So what we'll do is we'll make these pieces here just a little bit prettier. So in order to do that, from Bootstrap, what we're going to do is actually access some of the form control components. So we can see that these have a little bit nicer rounded edging. And so the way that we can do this is by using this class of form control on each of the different elements. So let's go ahead and copy this class. And then on our input here, we'll just paste in this class 3 times. And so when we refresh, go back to our web page, we can see now that that styling has been applied. Now by default, Bootstrap will take up the entire width of that. So what we'll do is we'll return this piece here as a set of columns in a given row. So in order to do that, what we can do is in our code, within the form section, what we're going to do is create a div, and we'll make the class a container. So this div is going to wrap around all 3 of the inputs. And so for each of the inputs, we're now going to create, actually within this class, we're going to create a row first. And this row, again, will wrap around all 3 inputs. Now within this row, for each item, what we're going to do is create a column. And so the way that we can do this is say div class, and we'll say column small. And so we'll just repeat this process now. For each of the input values here. And we have one more, so we'll say div class, call small, and let's go ahead and save this. See what our weather app looks like now. So we can see that this is much cleaner of a spread now. So the last thing we want to do now is actually change this button to be much less ugly. So again, Bootstrap provides a lot of different options here for buttons. What we'll want to do is simply just use perhaps this light button. So we can go ahead and copy just this btn-light, and we'll scroll down to our button. We'll say class button, pass in that style. Now when we switch back to our application, nothing has changed. So let's go ahead and see what we've done wrong here. So actually what we want to do is make the class a submit button of this style. So when we refresh this now, we can see that that styling has been applied. So in order to give it a bit more space, we'll just include a line break here and refresh again, and we can see that this has been pushed down nicely. So for another experiment, again, we'll just pass in Miami. Florida in the US. We'll hit find, and we can see now that all of this information has been returned. Now, one final thing we may want to do is actually change this just to be an integer. So in order to do that, what we can do now is actually take this floating point value in our application, and we'll just wrap, in our get weather function, what we'll do is we'll switch over here and we'll say that we want to return the integer value of this. And then we'll change our function definition up here to be an int. And then in our index, what we'll do down here is just apply a C to clarify that it's in degrees Celsius. So now let's go ahead, type in Miami, Florida, US, and I'm picking it because it's very warm. And I'm not very warm right now. We can see now that our temperature in this case, it returned Toronto's temperature. So let's try that again. Okay, so one of the things that I needed to change in this function here is that by default, it will actually always call Toronto. So what we want to do actually is replace all of these here with city name, state name, and the country name. And so this is just what happens when you recklessly copy and paste code. So let's go ahead and save this. We'll refresh our application again. And in this case, we'll pass in Miami, and we're going to pass in find. And we can see that this has actually returned the correct thing. Now, I did change this to an integer, so let's go ahead and quickly modify this by wrapping this in the integer function again. And we'll also update this to be an int. So finally, let's refresh it one last time. We'll pass in Miami here, Florida in the US. And we can see that we now get this accurate reading here with just a single integer value. So we covered a ton in this video. We covered how to create a shell of a Flask application, how to query the OpenWeather API in 2 different ways to get the latitude and longitude per location, as well as to get the current location, the current weather conditions. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and maybe click that little bell icon to be notified of when I release new videos. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.